pandemic year, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union and its consequences. And so this event is focusing on a new book by two very well-known influential scholars, Kristin Ghodsee and Orenstein. And I am going to hand this over, the virtual floor, to Peter Rutland, who has helped to organize this and who is going to moderate the conversation. Thank you very much, Peter. Peter, you need to turn on your mic, please.
My mute button is playing up. So welcome everybody, and looking forward to the discussion today on this book, which takes on the ambitious task of looking back at 30 years of experience in the 28 countries of our region. And after Drs. Orenstein and Ghodsee make about a 15-minute presentation. We will then go to Janet Johnson, who will talk for 10 minutes or so, and then I will wrap up with another 10 minutes of comments. Then we'll hand the floor back to Mitch and Kristen to respond, and then we'll open it up to take questions from the audience. And I would ask you to put the questions into the Q&A function. It's easier for us to keep track of the questions or comments there. We will be using the chat room to post links to various issues or scholars that come up during the debate. So I will turn over the floor for the first 15 minutes to our esteemed authors.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting us here today. This is the first time since the publication of the book that we've had an opportunity to discuss it with our audience, and we're really excited about that and very appreciative to ASN for extending this invitation. I want to tell you a little bit. I'm going to try and talk for more like 10 minutes. And Kristen, please signal me or send me a message in the chat when that 10 minutes is up. But I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, because I think that's really relevant to how we think about transition in the social sciences. And I hope everybody can see my share screen. Yes, okay. And then I'm going to just give a preview of the findings. This is a very data-rich project, so we're not going to go into all of our data here, but just give a kind of sketch overview of what we find. And of course, this is the book, Taking Stock of Shock, Social Consequences of the 1989 Revolutions, and it's out with Oxford since July of this year. So Kristen and I didn't initially intend to write a book together, but we began to think about it in just having a hallway type discussion as academics about a blog post that had come up from Branko Milanovic, For Whom the Wall Fell. And I'm displaying that now, his graphic for that. It was in the Globalist, in which he showed from an economic standpoint that only about 30% of former communist countries could be qualified as successes, and that he defines as countries that grew by at least 2% per annum per capita over the past 25 years. And the rest were kind of failure cases, including, I think, native Serbia, if I'm not mistaken. Milanovic hails from Serbia. And so I think this was a kind of a bitter article from somebody whose country is colored red in this picture as a clear failure. Countries that as of 2013 are still able to reach the level of real income achieved back in 1990. In other words, real income had not recovered since 1989 in 2013. So he was, you could sort of feel his annoyance about that. And in talking about it, Kristen and I discovered a lot about one another and a lot about our respective fields in the social science, I being a political science, she being an anthropologist, and about also the regions that we had studied, the sub-regions that we had studied, where I had focused mainly on the relatively successful Visegrad countries, and Kristen had done a lot of field work in Bulgaria and the Balkans, which of course had very different outcomes. You can kind of see on this chart a little bit. And what we realized very quickly was that though we had both been studying transition and the politics and economics of transition to some degree for the past 25 years, we had absolutely very disparate views about simple questions like, was it a success? Was it a failure? Did people do better? Did people do worse? And so being a political scientist studying Central Europe, I tended to have a view that, yeah, the transition had been very difficult for some, but there had been really enormous successes that came out of it. Poland is a kind of fairly clear case of that. And at the same time, from Kristen's perspective, the widely accepted view in her field in anthropology was that this had kind of been a huge disaster for a lot of people. And so being perhaps more open to different disciplinary perspectives than other social scientists, being in an interdisciplinary department of Russian and East European studies together, and being faithful that we could somehow resolve this issue, not only for ourselves, but for the field as a whole, we decided to engage in doing a big interdisciplinary project of data collection to try to answer this question, once and for all. Was the trajectory of reform positive or negative? Was there a J-curve trajectory, a sort of swoosh where people went down a bit, but then there was a big uptick? Or was this the disaster capitalism of, say, narrative of, say, Naomi Klein? Was that more really what happened here? And in getting into this, we realized, again, that different social science disciplines had very different perspectives. And these perspectives were rooted in different disciplinary approaches, different methods, and different data that they were collecting. So in economics, for instance, there's an emphasis on average economic statistics. You'll see that this blog post is based on average GDP per capita. It's often average GDP is one of the very common measures in economics on a national basis. Whereas in anthropology, for instance, there is a tendency to have much less in the way of national averages and much more in the way of talking to specific people who have specific experiences that can be documented in a very different way than in economics. And in political science, we do a lot of public opinion research. Public opinion research is highly regarded among certain people in the social sciences, but also totally dismissed by other people as absolutely fallacious. People don't really know what they're experiencing. They say all sorts of things on these, public opinion polls. You can't take it very seriously. Subjective, too subjective, not objective enough. And similarly, demography was the other field that we looked at, where, of course, we were aware and had been reading, as probably all of you had, throughout the 90s and 2000s, that there was a very deep demographic crisis in many countries. For instance, in Russia, this collapse in male life expectancy. Anybody, I think, who'd been to East Europe in the 1990s saw, these people, suffering. I'll bring you back to the picture we have on the front of our book of, like, a young woman in pink kind of facing boldly the future, and then this guy passed out on the ground, which was honestly, it was a familiar sight for anybody who'd been to Central and Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe during that time period. So again, there's this very positive view of a transition. You see this also in images. It's very hard to find images that show both success and failure. There's a lot of, if you look up East Europe economy, you'll see a lot of images of sort of fancy markets, Christmas markets, or you'll see images of destitution, like these poor kids in some former Soviet republic in bad housing and poor conditions. So what we, and of course these perspectives are also highly politicized. So it's not only that different methods and different sort of data will point you in the direction of really different results, right? But also that these perspectives are highly politicized. The international institutions in the West, and we show this very clearly in the book. I'm rather proud of that element of the book, that we show really clearly in the book that international organizations are pitching their messaging and trying to present everything in the brightest possible light all the time. This still goes on, by the way. I fight this battle sometimes painfully and unfortunately on Facebook from time to time, where a lot of people are just very, very concerned with presenting everything as like, oh yeah, it's perfect, transition's over, everything's great, people did really well. And we document how the EBRD, for instance, does that in its reports. And at the same time, there are political figures, notably Vladimir Putin in Russia, who's taken on this disaster capitalism view of the 1990s to say, this was horrible, 1990s were a disaster, capitalism, democracy is sham, that's why we need to consolidate authoritarian rule in my country. And we were talking a few weeks ago with some people in Georgia who were expressing their frustration that anytime they criticize anything about the economy, they're told that they're pro-Russian, right? Because of the political polarization in a way around these two different narratives of transition. So our question is, really we were naive, honestly, at the beginning of this project. We thought that if we gathered enough data from economics, from public opinion, from demography and anthropology, we would come up with an answer to the question, which of these narratives is right? Is it the disaster capitalism narrative, or is it the J-curve perspective? That was naive, because in the end, we found that both were correct, actually. That depending on, and I'm going to cut to the chase here because I just have a minute left, I feel like. But if you, I'm just going to show you one chart that we reproduce in the book that kind of tells the story in a nutshell, which is that depending on which countries you were in, you could have experienced a J-curve transition, or which countries or which demographic group or what age group or what education group, you could have experienced a J-curve transition. But if you were in a different country or age group or education group or whatever, you could have experienced the disaster capitalism in the same place. So this chart before you simply shows the blue line charts the trajectory of the US Great Depression, which is one of the deepest recessions in world history, okay? And it shows that after a few years, like 3 or 4 years, I guess, the depression bottomed out, and after 10 years, US returned to growth. That trajectory is similar, not exactly the same, but similar to what happened in the top 10 transition countries that are marked in green. Okay, there's about 29 transition countries. And so we have the top 10 in green, the bottom 10 in red, and the median ones in yellow. The top 10 had experienced something similar to the Great Depression, where you might say at the beginning, if you'd said to somebody, well, you're going to have a 20% drop in income, but after 10 years, you're going to grow a lot, and then you're going to be 80% above where you were before. A lot of people would have said, okay, bring it on. I'm ready for this, right? If you told people, however, that you're going to have a 60% drop in income, and that after 25 years, you still are lower than you were before, which is, I guess, kind of the case in Serbia. I don't know when they particularly got out of it, but these are averages. But I don't think anybody would have honestly said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. That's absolutely what we want to do, right? Even the median country in post-communist country experienced a depression, which is approximately 2 to 6 times greater than the Great Depression. Lasted, they didn't get back their economy to 89 levels until 17 years after, and have had modest growth, sort of since then. So the answer in a nutshell, and I'll pass it off to Kristen right now, is that we gather in this book from many, many fields, really strong evidence, both for the J-curve perspective and for the disaster capitalism perspective, which gives us a whole different perspective on transition, which we would address as an inequalities perspective. That the essential narrative here is that there are growing inequalities, and for some people that means that they do fine, and other people do terribly, in essence. But Kristen, I'm sure you want to have more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, given that we have limited amount of time and I want to give lots of time for the discussants to chime in and then to have lots of questions and answers, I'll just, basically just chime in and say, obviously this chart shows the differences, again, looking at the unit of the nation state. But what it doesn't show very clearly, and what is something that we were really concerned about in the book, were the disparities within the nation state, right? So the differences between urban and rural populations, the difference between educated and less educated, the difference between men and women, the difference between the old and the young. And I think that the thing that's really important is when we look at the data, and I think it's really important that we're not just talking about the economic data, which is very important and tells a very powerful story, but we're also looking at the demographic data, the excess mortality, the plunging fertility, and the massive amount of outmigration from this region that has left many of these countries, you know, the top 10 fastest shrinking countries in the world are now in this region of the world. So we also look at public opinion data from starting in the 90s and going up until 2019, I believe is the last survey that we had access to, which clearly shows that there was a lot of resentment and a lot of frustration among the populations about how the transition was being handled. But there wasn't a real sense of agency in terms of what the governments of these countries were able to do vis-a-vis the imposition of certain kinds of policies from the international financial institutions. And then finally, the ethnographic data, which is the data that I was the most familiar with coming into the project, which really tells a lot of very personal stories of despair. And absolute sort of abject poverty and the decline into that poverty, which I think is really important. The feeling of going backward, the feeling that some members of your country, a small group of them, are doing really, really, really well for themselves at the same time that many, many people are doing very badly. And the rise of this inequality perspective that Mitchell just mentioned. And so it's not just that people got poor. And I believe, I can't remember, Mitchell, you can correct me, 190 million people in the region were below the poverty line at peak poverty in 1998, which is a massive amount of poverty in a region that didn't have those kinds of economic disparities prior to 1989. So it's not just the absolute poverty, the absolute real living on $5.50 a day, but it's also the relative economic inequality whereby you see certain people, and this was exactly the conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago with a politician in Georgia about how it is that these inequalities really present themselves in people's feeling and narratives about the transition. And so I think Mitchell is absolutely, you know, spot on to use the economic data to highlight the fact that these transitions were really different for different populations. But we find that replicated in the demographic data, in the public opinion data, as well as in the ethnographic data. And I think that's what's so unique about the book, is that it really is bringing together and kind of a wide perspective on the transition from multiple social science disciplines, looking at 30 years of data of 29 different countries and trying to kind of parse through the narrative to tell a particular story, maybe a story that people don't necessarily want to hear. And it is, you know, unfortunately, a story that sometimes jives with the politics of certain leaders in the region who want to say that things are a lot worse than maybe they are right now. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to try to have a multifaceted and nuanced view of this process, which has become so incredibly politicized, as Mitchell pointed out, by international financial institutions that are personally invested in a particular narrative about the success of transition, as well as domestic economic elites who benefited from certain privatization policies or the restitution of previously expropriated properties or certain kinds of, you know, luck, I guess is the right term, or good fortune to be in the right place at the right time, to be able to have taken for themselves a large portion of what were once previously collectively owned resources. And so that is a narrative that we really need to address, in which we try as much as possible, trying to be as neutral as possible by looking at the data that we have to tell in the book. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Kristen. Everybody's running on time, so I will hand over the floor to Professor Janet Johnson of our Political Science Department at Brooklyn College at the University of New York.
I feel like this task of discussing this book is almost impossible, given that the book is almost impossible, right? So the book is Herculean and crucial. Many political scientists suggested that the collapse of communism was a natural experiment in the 1990s, which I found heartless. But I think the least we can do is come back and take stock of shock, to use their title, of the last 4 decades. And as we've heard, the approach here is to marshal both quantitative, macro level, and ethnographic, community and individual level data to get a fuller picture of what happened in these 29 countries. The analytical framework, as Mitchell laid out, is this kind of contrast between the J-curve perspective of great success, mostly from the quantoids, and the disaster capitalism of dismal failure perspective, mostly from the qualitoids, I'm going to say, with a focus on the questions of socioeconomic inequality. Some of the things that I'm going to pull out that I think are really were useful for me to think about and know is that this was the worst economic crisis in peacetime ever experienced. So we just saw that the graph of that. And even economists by the mid 1990s or late 1990s realized that the shock to society wasn't going to be that quick and revised their framework somewhat and moved beyond this discussion that I remember from grad school between shock therapy versus gradualism. It doesn't seem to matter. And the peak misery is in 1998, 1999 for the region. They begin to kind of disaggregate the countries, and this is what I pulled out. The countries that seem to have had the most misery seem to be Georgia, Kosovo, Serbia, Tajikistan, Ukraine. If we look at GDP per capita, Kyrgyzstan, Romania, Bulgaria, Latvia, Croatia, Uzbekistan. If we look at poverty rates, countries that seem to have the least misery were the ones with the biggest investments from outside, like the former East Germany or Bosnia after the war. Those with oil resources were the Visegrad countries plus Slovenia, at least demographically, and point to kind of these explanations we've been throwing around for years, that they had a shorter period of communism. They drank wine versus hard alcohol in those places. They're closer to the West, closer to the EU. But it's important to note that Central Asian countries did worse on some things and better on other things because the men didn't seem to drink so much. There's so much variability, right? I'm just throwing out some of the stuff that's in here. I love the quote, "The wall didn't fall for all," right? I think that's important. I don't think the wall fell for anyone, right? They pulled down the wall and it ended up being better for some in some places. The ethnographic data here is amazing, right? Like ethnography is not really meant to be summarized. So an attempt to try to summarize it is really, really admirable. And what I got out of that is portraits of desperate, and these are mostly from their chapters. So I'm using the analysis that came out of the book, right? But lots of portraits of desperation, right? There's a lot of desperation that needs to be noticed. The futility of collective resistance, right? There was pretty much nothing you could do collectively. So that's why we have outmigration as an individualistic and the only strategy possible. I was really shocked, I have to say, that people argue that outmigration is a good thing. I had never heard that. I don't know who these people are. I mean, well, I know there's some ethnographers who talk about the benefits for the individuals, but I never thought about that as a collective thing. In the ethnographic data, we find importance of nostalgia during crises. You can't miss that, I don't think, in Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia. We find new forms of nationalism and religiosity and then populism out of the shared experience of despair and this nostalgia. And I love the sort of conclusion that comes out of this, that Eastern Europe may have an even greater propensity for fairness than other places, right? That all of that is given this kind of appreciation, communism and then the collapse of communism or socialism, depending on which discipline we come from, creates a greater propensity for thinking about questions of inequality. I'm mapping this like I would for my grad students. So the practical application of the book is, in the conclusion, a really interesting argument. What would have happened if they had given universal instead of targeted benefits? And that universal benefits during the worst of the transition might have helped soften the transition. They might have been more doable because targeted benefits weren't really doable. Like They kept benefits, but you couldn't get to the office, you couldn't get them in the mail, you couldn't actually qualify. They're just, in Russia at least, the benefits weren't worth much anyway. But if there had been real investment in universal benefits, that might have been a very different experience for people individually, but also politically, and perhaps we would not have the right-wing populism that we have today. In terms of conceptual significance, I think the end is this sort of argument that even though it's been 30-something years, that it's important to think about this region, that these post-communist countries as a region with shared experiences of the trauma, not just shared experiences of communism, but shared experience of the trauma afterwards. So just a couple comments or questions that I have. As a political scientist who leans more towards ethnographic than quantitative methods, I'm a little puzzled by the conflation of different methodological approaches with different disciplines, right? So political scientists do ethnography, not all anthropologists do ethnography either. Some of them are counters as well. I'm puzzled by the glossing over of different epistemologies, right? So it's not just that there's different methodologies, but different assumptions about truth. And there's a little bit in there where they wrestle with this, but there's a lot within comparativist political scientists who think about qualitative methods, who do a lot more with thinking about how to make this transdisciplinary instead of kind of multidisciplinary. And I think that would be an interesting way to go. I mean, they chose to go this other way. I'm not saying one way is better or worse. But I do think the decision, and then the decision to use ethnographic data mostly to elaborate and explain the quantitative data is another interesting move. I mean, partially you just can't summarize all of the ethnographic data, but ethnographic data was kind of called upon to support and elaborate the existing economic data, which gives priority to the quantitative data in a way. I think that these methodological and epistemological choices lead to the sense that the scholarship is so divided between this optimistic and pessimistic understanding. And I think there's a lot more stuff that is more mixed and is dealing with the mixed. Just to kind of throw something out there, my colleagues and I, Mara Lazda and Cataline Fabian, put out a book. And we have, this is a picture, just to kind of was thinking about Mitchell's pictures here, how do we represent ambiguity? And we decided to embrace the notion of ambiguity. And as a political scientist, I was like, that is a cop-out. I don't think that's fair. I really appreciate that this book tries to get more clarity and more data. It's an empiricist bonanza. I love that. But in the end, I'm still left with this notion that maybe ambiguity is the best we can do when we take real consideration of the variability, which we have to do, even as we can map the shared experience of crisis. A couple other comments I would say as a gender scholar and reflecting Kristen's recent book on why women have better sex under socialism, I was a little surprised that equality was almost only social economic. And again, understandable, you can't do everything. But there is, I would say, to the political scientist quantitatives, that there is a way of disaggregating the data. There's a lot of really interesting work being done by feminist political scientists who are figuring out ways to do intersectionality using data. And that would have been an interesting way to meld the two, or to consider the political science and the ethnographic data collectively. And just to give an example of kind of how this becomes problematic, I'm sympathetic to the claim that's made near the end of the book that the voluntary pronatalist policies, such as Russia's maternity capital, might be better understood within the socialist legacy of universal benefits. I get that I too have that same impression that like any kind of benefits that help women raise children, given the poverty and the dismal situation of a lot of women in these places, is kind of a good thing. But because the broader context of decreased contraception and abortion rights, most dramatically in Poland now, the persecution of feminists and LGBT activists and just LGBTQ people in general in the region, and the rise of anti-genderism puts a whole much more sinister gloss on those policies, right? And because that stuff kind of has to be segmented off, it misses it. And similarly, I would say, and there's a really great discussion about about what China did in Vietnam in terms of being able to do this without this gigantic depression. And I think that, I mean, that's important. That's been a central sort of discussion point for all of us looking at the region is, you know, there's the China approach versus the Russia approach. But because they've left out questions of coercion from the discussion, because this is focused on social economic stuff, but that leaves out, you know, the fact that China's achieved its dramatic economic growth based on mass violence at Tiananmen, mass violence against women's bodies and forced abortions over the last 50 years, and even genocide against the Uyghurs, it appears now, to create that growth. So, I mean, these are all questions of scope. I mean, you know, it's not fair in some way to say, you know, why didn't you do this? But the scope matters in terms of what we see, and the disciplinary approach also matters in terms of what we see. And so I just wanted to kind of throw those out as some things to discuss. But this is, as I said, an empiricist bonanza. It's incredibly useful for scholars like me, who's primarily a Russianist, but also looks at other places around the world. It's going to be great for students and graduate students, and hopefully the World Bank and the IMF will look at it and have a much more thoughtful approach to development in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Janet. So I'll try and discipline myself to keep within the 10 minutes. So first off, this is a very useful book, and I totally appreciate your desire to get beyond the optimist-pessimist polarity of debate over the transition. I think it did become counterproductive pretty quickly, and it did become driven by ideology, driven by concerns, politics, self-interest, disciplinary defensiveness that had nothing to do with what was happening on the ground. So I think it's time to kind of move on from that dichotomy and to go from, as you say, from either or to both and. In trying to analyze the positives and the negatives from the transformation process. Other points of agreement that I'll get on the table is I totally agree that the state capture by elites, the corruption was not foreseen, was enabled by the IFIs in many cases, and it remains a colossal problem in all of these countries, even some of the success stories. Second, of course, the inequality issue that you addressed, again, terribly important, that should have been addressed earlier and by and large wasn't. The collapse of public services and health, those are all excellent points that I'm totally in agreement with, and the criticism of some of the policies of the IFIs. Onto my disagreements or points where I've got concerns. One is the framing that much of the argument that you make is the both success and problem, but the framing, the picture on the cover is of somebody's a homeless person or a drunk on the street. Now, I could take that picture in Middletown, Connecticut today. I could take it certainly in San Francisco or Manchester. So, and it's not just the picture on the cover, also many of the chapter titles have words in them like despair, disappointment, catastrophe, and crisis. So I think the tone of the book, I'm not sure if this was your intention or not, but it comes across as more on the disaster side than the yay, hey, everything is great side. And the crisis frame in particular is quite commonly introduced. Is it a fertility crisis if women are choosing to have fewer children? Is the post-socialist Europe unique in that? Of course it isn't. And so I would have liked to see more comparative data on the fertility decline in Western Europe. And so the shock therapy, I don't think can be blamed for the fertility decline. And I would see it as a fertility decline, not as a crisis. Similarly, the migration crisis, I don't see migration as a crisis. It's a choice in difficult circumstances. Janet said, who are these people who are seeing migration as a choice. Well, you're looking at one. I migrated from the UK. Does that mean that I blame Margaret Thatcher and I'm traumatized by the Thatcherite shock therapy? No, it was a choice. It was a choice under constraints, but it's a choice. And I think that's true. That's a framing issue. And if you portray it as a crisis, you're prejudging the issue, and you're playing into the hands of the nationalists in the region who frame fertility and migration as crises, and then adopt these extreme measures to try and deal with the crisis, which is their own conceptualization of it. On the question of nationalism, this is an Association for Study of Nationalities panel, so I'll just record the fact that nationalism is kind of absent from the book, right? And this partly I'm reiterating what Janet said, that by focusing on the social, you're leaving out the political. And obviously for many people in the region, the achievement of national independence was not a trivial thing. And it was worth the suffering and the trauma for the sake of, as one of your interlocutors, the Czech woman said, a better life for their children and grandchildren. And so I think that the nationalist framing of it, the achievement of collective freedom from Soviet rule and from communism is something that has to be put into the mix. And certainly it's in people's minds in the region, but in the way that you've used the opinion surveys, you're asking about inequality, about economic issues, about images of the past, the red nostalgia. But if people are asked directly, do you want to live under communist rule? Do you want to live under Russian rule? Only single figures of people will be saying that. Whereas, okay, maybe 10 to 30% of them might express some kind of nostalgia for the Soviet past. But as Putin said, if you don't regret the past, you've got no heart. If you think you can bring it back, you've got no head. And I think that does resonate with, that's how I would interpret the red nostalgia. It's a coping device, it's a psychological coping device. It's not a political program for the present or the future. Couple more points, and I'm cognizant of the time elapsing, is what choices did these places have in the early 1990s? I mean, yeah, there was the Chinese variant. They could have shot people in the streets and kept things going, Lukashenko style, for another couple of decades. That was one option that was on the table. Other options of a Swedish type social market economy, I'm afraid it wasn't on the table. Certainly that's what Gorbachev wanted, and that's what many of the Democrats wanted somehow to achieve, but they just didn't have the social institutions, the state or civil society capacity to do that. Now, the IFIs could have done a better job of trying to help them manage the transition, and so they share the blame. But I don't really see that much choice on the table, and between the leap into capitalism. That said, one point which I think could have been made stronger or discussed more directly in the book is that there was a lot of customization of the policy package in different countries, as both of you know very well, that especially Poland, for example, no mass privatization, wage caps, and so on and so forth. They did customize the neoliberal package to suit the country, and that was particularly true in Russia. So the idea that they were all forced to adopt a set of rigid policies simply isn't the case. And I tried to argue that in some detail in my 2013 article on neoliberalism in Russia in Review of International Political Economy. The Russian elite were very selective in which of the advice they followed and which they ignored. And so I think there's more flexibility for local actors have more responsibility there than you may be giving them credit for. And again, I totally buy Mitch's chart with 1/3 of them did very well and 1/3 of them did badly. And the bad category are partly due to bad choices by leaders, but also a lot of the ones in that bad outcome category are the ones that had civil wars and so on. So that ties back to the nationalism question that Georgia wanted to push aggressively a state of Georgia for the Georgians, and that helped trigger the civil wars. Okay, final point is a framing point that the depression that you document in the 1990s really is traumatic and severe, but there is recovery in most of the countries in the 2000s. And I think a lot of the chapter discussions focus on the 1990s, the bad decade, and don't give equal airtime to the good decade. And in interpreting the collapse, economic collapse of the 1990s, it's not the transition that's to blame, it's the communism that's to blame, right? The system started collapsing in the 1980s, with the Polish martial law and the stagnation in the Soviet economy. And so the consequences of that decade plus long collapse of central planning showed up in the 1990s. But you're really kind of blaming the messenger. You're blaming the IMF for documenting the implosion of the economy, when the problem was that structures of economic management that had been built up for decades were falling apart. So you will allude to this argument a couple of times by referencing David Brooks, not my favorite columnist, but I'm actually agreeing with him on this one, that communism is the problem, not capitalism. And on that point, I will cede the floor to our authors. You can respond to our comments for 5 or 10 minutes, or start taking questions from the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me respond to just a few points, and probably Kristen may want to follow with something. So, on this point where you say shock therapy simply can't be blamed and one should blame communism, I think that's an absolutely valid point. And it's the reason that we actually in the book, despite having the word shock in the title, which is a little sneaky, I guess, but we don't actually at all analyze in this book. We don't analyze at all. And we took out everywhere where we had been, what caused this, okay? This is not a book about causal inference. It's not a book about causes at all. It's just a book about what happened, right? And I think you're right that you could blame a lot of this on communism. You could blame a lot of it on the policies of transition. You could blame a lot of it on just, some like the falling apart of the Soviet Union, for instance, right? Some random event. So we don't get into that. The reason that we don't do that is because we think it's shocking enough and important enough in this discipline to talk about what happened, because in fact, there is no common view about what happened at all in the transition. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to shock people into looking at other disciplines and seeing, wow, what I thought happened in the transition actually didn't happen, right? There was actually a bunch of other stuff that was also happening that maybe my whole discipline never picked up on. So that brings me to the question, I think, that Janet talked about, one of the points that she talked about that arguing that we sort of reified disciplines here. And I do think that that's a fairly valid point, honestly. I think that we're trying to sketch out, like in the economics chapter, we sketch out the mainstream economics position of the reformers. Of course, knowing full well that there's a lot of other people who don't support the reforms, right? And sort of following that forward into what their analysis of what happened in the transition and their refusal to even look at some of this economic data. So I do think that our method, we sort of are data driven in a way more. So we were really trying to collect data and then kind of read back to that why different disciplines were choosing to collect this data. Interestingly enough, some data is collected, some data is not collected. So when we come around to the public opinion area, it turns out international organizations are great at collecting economic data and demographic data, but they rarely bother to ask people what they think about the process. And that sort of tells you a lot, right? That they're not that interested in what people are saying. So I do think that is a reasonable critique. Obviously, if we went further to analyze like all the sort of areas within a specific discipline, I'm sure you're right that we could have done more justice to some people who were engaged in a way the similar type of process that we're engaged with. We were more trying to explain why they came up with this data and what they did with it, basically, because we were in a way maybe more data focused than we were disciplinary focused. So I think that's a fair critique. I think back to Peter, this question about nationalism, I can't respond to all of it, or crisis, that in a way that we emphasize more the crisis point. And I think that is also, by the way, a fair critique, because we're writing for a largely Western audience who largely believes in the J curve approach. And we do mention it, and we do provide a lot of evidence, like I've shown you, for that approach. I do think, by the way, we also provide tons of data from the 2000s, so we don't totally focus on the 90s. But I think the emphasis is more on persuading people in the international organizations that there, in fact, was a huge economic crisis, which honestly would be very. Let me put it this way: I don't think that if you polled if you polled all social scientists who worked on transition for 25 years, and you asked them, was this the biggest economic crisis in world history? Nobody would say yes. Very few people who would say yes. And so I think that we took the view that, yeah, we pushed a little more on that point. And you can argue that that plays into the hands of nationalists and populists. And I agree with that we can definitely be faulted for giving, therefore, somewhat more, like our Georgian colleagues, giving somewhat more support to this disaster capitalism narrative. That's not what we believe, of course, but people will read it that way. And we're actually fairly comfortable with that, because part of the message, the political message we give in the book, is that these we need to take these reactive politics more seriously, that they're actually based on something. They're actually based on a certain reality, which we've erased and ignored. And in fact, a lot of what they're doing, we agree with, actually, and doesn't depart very substantially from mainstream social democratic policies in the West. So in other words, if Elizabeth Warren had introduced, Orban's latest family policies, she would have been applauded for that on the left, right? And I want to get into a little bit this issue of, of course, I think that Janet's right that, or I forget who said it now, but maybe it's Peter or Janet, who said that there's, of course, this very conservative rhetoric, right, and very conservative policies around restricting abortion and all these things that are bad authoritarian policies, agreed. However, if you look more carefully at the social policies that are being introduced, they actually don't, in many cases, they don't actually do those sorts of things. They're actually different, right? So when you look at the policy level, that rhetoric disappears. And for instance, the Polish Family 500 Plus is paid to gay families, as well as it's paid to straight families, to single parent families, as well as to married families, right? So it does not discriminate. Similarly, that's not so much true in I guess in Hungary, gay marriage is banned, but in the area, for instance, of employment policy, which has been extremely important, those policies apply to Roma, right, just as well as they do to other populations. In fact, Roma have probably been more beneficiaries of the anti-unemployment policies of Orban than others, even though he's also carrying on this rhetoric of anti-Roma, right, and anti-minority and anti-immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So I just think that our point is not to prop up these people and say, oh yeah, these guys are great. Our point is that that liberals have failed in this region. They failed because they presented an economic program which only helps a third of the people, and they have ignored policies that they could equally well introduce that would help a majority of the people. And in a democracy, you need to probably create economic policies that help more than a third of the people if you want it to be sustained. And I think that's the lesson of populism, honestly, for liberals. And it's unfortunately a lesson that has not been learned in Eastern Europe pretty much at all. And finally, I just want to say that, what were the choices? I think that's a great thing, but maybe I won't say anything about that because we don't really talk about what caused this, right? But just to say that the China-Vietnam example shows that there were choices. I think that Kornai's view that socialism was unreformable has to be wrong. It has to be wrong, because we have China and Vietnam that did in fact reform communism with no transitional recession, right? Over a very, very long period of time. Yes, under quite different conditions. Could those conditions have been replicated by international organizations who wanted to do that? Yes, I think they could. It doesn't mean that you would have had to shoot everybody, I don't think. It simply wasn't tried. But then again, that's a subject for a different book, I think, in a way. It's just suggestive. We can only stop at the point that says, definitely socialism was reformable.
All right, I'll just
Kristen, you
jump
want to?
I'll jump in. I have a bunch of things to say, but I'm going to try to be brief because I know that we want to get questions in from the people who are watching. So a couple of things, and like I said, I'm going to try to be succinct here. The first is about epistemology and methodology, and I do think that you're absolutely right that it was a choice to actually decide that there was a truth of the matter that needed to be known, rather than to question whether or not any truth was knowable from an epistemological point of view, and to privilege the quantitative data over the ethnographic data. That was also a methodological choice. And part of that, I think I want to emphasize what Mitchell just said, is because we were very much in dialogue with people at the World Bank. We had a conference at the University of Pennsylvania in November of 2019, where World Bank economists attended and listened to our presentations and our discussions, and they were absolutely positively baffled by the anthropologists and didn't know what to make of what people were saying. And so, yes, there was a conscious decision to try to be as empirical as we could be. I think in the background and in the ethnographic chapter, I do try to talk about some of these epistemological questions of how we know what we know and why we know what we know. And without essentializing disciplines, I did think it was important to point out that different disciplines have very different epistemological standpoints from which they come and which they emerge. And that the reason that these data that are there for anyone to see were not paid attention to during the transition process is because they were emerging from disciplines that were alien to other disciplines, and they didn't know how to speak to each other. I think, again, this is one of the beauties of coming out of a Russian and East European studies program, because Mitchell and I can run into each other in the hallway and argue about things. And we come from very different disciplinary perspectives, and we can actually help each other understand what these, and I really do think that is truly the genesis of this book. And I think it's truly valuable for that reason, because it truly is an interdisciplinary, maybe not necessarily a transdisciplinary conversation, but an interdisciplinary conversation. And at least that gets the conversation started. A second thing that I also want to pick up on is the idea that the international financial institutions, when they were faced with bad news, as in the EBRD life and transition surveys, which were done in 3 waves, they very consciously tried to bury that news or to spin it to their advantage. And a great example of this is there was a big kind of press release from the EBRD that the happiness gap was closed between East and Western Europe in 2006. And what's really clear when you dig down into the data, it's not at all that East Europeans got happier. It was that West Europeans got more miserable, and that was somehow a good outcome, right? So there was a really clear sense in which, when they had data that showed that support for markets was falling, that supports for democracy were falling, that in fact, some people did say it was better to live under a communist regime. They just sort of buried that information in the tables in the back of the report, and they didn't highlight it. And I think that was one of the things that was really interesting for us, because we were going through those reports with a very fine-tooth comb, going through that data and looking for all of this data, which had been, the EBRD didn't hide it, it was on their website, but they just sort of didn't highlight it in their executive summaries and their nice little bullet points and infographics and reports that they put up for people to read. And I think that's really important as well, to point out that there was a little bit of sort of obfuscation going on here about what was actually happening. The third thing is, again, to echo what Mitchell said, this idea that 1/3 of the people were doing really well ignores the fact that 2/3 of the people were doing really poorly. And I do think that I take issue with what Peter said about communism was to blame for all of this, that it was this inevitable catastrophe because of the ways in which the economy was going in the 80s. I mean, that's a generalization about the entire region. And I do think there were bits and pieces of these economies that were functioning. I wrote a book on tourism and Bulgaria, and in the Bulgarian tourism sector was working actually quite well. And then it got privatized because of international financial institutions, and just utterly devastated the way that privatization was handled. It's robber swindler privatization is what they call it in Bulgaria. These, management employee buyouts, which were absolutely corrupt, and the international financial institutions looked the other way. So there's a lot of, again, we don't in the book talk about causality. We made a decision not to do that because we wanted this book to be a book that would appeal to the international policy community in a way that sort of avoided sort of making judgments one way or the other. But I do think it's really important to realize that there were a lot of things that weren't just happening in the 90s, but also happened in the 2000s. We also just the other day wrote an op-ed about vaccine hesitancy in Eastern Europe. And one of the things that's being regurgitated over and over again is that social trust, the low social trust in public institutions in Eastern Europe is a result of communism, when in fact the data shows very clearly that that's not the case. Social trust declined precipitously in the 90s. So, all right, enough about that. The other thing is the gender framing and the nationalist framing. Yes, you're absolutely right. We chose to focus on socioeconomic data. We chose to focus on socioeconomic inequality. That was partially as a result of the constraints of trying to write a book about 30 years of data for 29 countries. There was only so much disaggregation that we could do without the book being like 1,000 pages long. I also felt very, strongly that both Mitchell and I have other work out there in the world that deals very clearly with some of the issues around gender, around elderly populations, around neoliberal reforms that are sort of, informing the context of the book as we've written it. And then this language of crisis. And I agree with you, Peter, that we do, that there are words, the patriotism of despair, which by the way, is the title of a very well-known book about Russia. So we were using language that emerged largely from the region. You're absolutely right that a lot of leaders, nationalist leaders in particular, like to use the word crisis in terms of fertility or outmigration. But I think it's also important to realize that ordinary people use the term crisis. They use the term catastrophe. They use the term despair. It's something that you hear. I'm in Belgrade right now. I'm in Serbia, and I've been having conversations with people. And this is something that comes up over and over and over again, that there's this willful ignoring or refusal to acknowledge the pain and suffering of people, not only in the 90s, which obviously in former Yugoslavia was quite severe, but also with the the financial crisis in 2008. And the fact that many of these countries actually were doing fine until 2008, and then they get plunged back into a depression after 2008, sort of a double dip depression kind of situation. And women who want to have children, women who want to start families, do really feel that their fertility choices are severely limited by the economic situation in their countries. And they also tend to use the word crisis. So I think that, one of the problems, again, is the disciplinary problem. There are terms that can be analyzed from a discursive level. And then there are terms as an ethnographer that I really want to just sort of appropriate from people and put them out there. These are the words that people are using. These are the kinds of anecdotes that anthropologists and ethnographers in the region have heard. These are kind of representative views of people who sort of lived through that transition, many of whom, by the way, are obviously still alive today and are talking about these experiences. I literally just sat in a pizzeria here in Belgrade last weekend with some Serbian women who were talking about their memories of the early 90s and the absolute horrors and shocks of the breakup of Yugoslavia. There's a museum of Yugoslavia here, which is one of like the most incredibly nostalgic institutions that you could imagine around the communist experience, and especially around Tito. So I think that there's a tension about trying to, and it's a tension that is a very fair criticism of the book in some ways. It is the fact that we are doing an interdisciplinary book rather than a transdisciplinary book. We are very much coming at the data from very fixed points within particular disciplines and reading that data as a sort of disciplinary product, rather than kind of blurring the disciplinary boundaries and using a kind of transdisciplinary epistemology, which I think ultimately would have been a really interesting project, but it also would have been a project that would not necessarily have appealed to people in the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the EBRD, which in some ways was our audience. Like, I felt like it was important, and I know Mitchell especially felt this way, that we really wanted to have a conversation with people whose decisions about policies as they are applied to this region actually impact people's lives. It's one thing to have a discussion among ourselves as scholars about sort of that policy, but it's a completely different thing to talk to people who literally hold the levers of finance for this or that project, who tell governments to have universal or targeted benefits. And so, especially given the rise of populism in the region right now and the kind of resurgence of nationalism and all of the things that are going on, I think we have to have, hopefully 30 years has been enough time to try to have a slightly depoliticized, it's never going to be fully depoliticized, but a slightly depoliticized, somewhat neutral discussion of just what happened. Because if we can't even agree on what happened, how can we even begin to have a conversation about what was responsible or what could have been done differently? And that to me is the real value, I hope, of the book. Again, time will tell, but I think that's what we were trying to do. I don't know, Mitchell, if you want to correct me. Yeah, okay.
No, I think we should move on absolutely to questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I didn't realize reading the book kind of naively that you were kind of having the World Bank, IMF types as a target audience. That kind of didn't occur to me. Now I see a little bit more clearly what's going on there, because I'm mostly interacting with students, undergraduate students, and they're all totally, of course, Naomi Klein is right, like disaster. So I have to go the other direction to get them to see that there are some things working out there. So there's these different audiences. So talking of the IFIs, I'd like to pull up first the question from Don Van Atter in the Q&A, where he does ask directly about how you conceive of the kind of evolution of the staff of the World Bank and IMF. And Don seems to be concurring with you that there was not a high level of competence in the 1990s staffing. Do you think that this has improved now? Do you think that the IFIs are more amenable to the kind of points that you're making about the need for social market economy and so on? Is that something we can be cautiously optimistic about?
Absolutely. I definitely think so. Just in terms of, I have very personal experience of this because in the 90s, I was married to a Bulgarian who ended up working at the World Bank, he was, straight out of law school, had very little experience in international financial institutions or, economic policy, but there he was, working in the country office of Bulgaria. And so I definitely think our experience, Mitchell, I know you can speak to this more directly, our experience, at least recently, with the folks in Washington at the World Bank is that they are much more amenable to this perspective.
Yeah, the World Bank co-sponsored our conference, right? That's not the research that we did, of course, but I would say that there's a couple different periods. The initial sort of rah-rah period where basically a group of Harvard, MIT economists set the agenda. And there was a widespread belief in the Washington consensus as kind of the core way to sort of change it. That there were big differences between Latin America, East Europe, and And then there was a correction in 1996 with the Plan to Market, from Plan to Market sort of World Development Report, I believe, of the World Bank, which coincided with the view that, oh my God, we got some things wrong, especially we didn't understand institutions. Institutions really matter. We can't just have markets and fix everything. We got to actually build institutions. And that was the beginning of kind of like a disappointment. In fact, the Economics of Transition, that journal, changed its name eventually to Economics of Transition and Institutions, I think, or something like that. And so there was that. And then I think of course, the articulation of the Putin disaster narrative really shook things up. And there was a decline of interest in the region. I think that honestly, there are people who are more open to that. I mean, the World Bank will talk about it now, but it's a pretty thin, it's only a few people. And I think the overarching view is still the same, that everything was great, and what in the world are you talking about,
Right. Yeah, I mean, Mitchell and I don't know, when we went to the World Bank and I can't remember, I'm blanking on her name, but we met the chief economist of
for Europe, Central Asia.
Europe and Central Asia. And it was like a newsflash to her that there were these depressions in the 90s, right? I mean, she just seemed genuinely kind of surprised.
She was shocked, and she turned to our partner and said, "Is that true?" It was like, yes.
Yeah, she didn't believe us. So yeah, I do think you're absolutely right. If you're talking to undergraduate students who have read Naomi Klein, it's like a one set of audience. And if you're talking to the chief economist of Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank, it's a different audience. And I do think that the audience matters, but I also think that it's really important to just, as an ethnographer, again, coming back to Janet's point about epistemology, I am always a little uncomfortable about like pointing my finger and saying there is a there is a truth of the matter. And yet I think that it's really important that we should have some common sense of what actually happened. I really think that that's essential if we're going to start talking about causality and what could have been done differently.
Great. We do have another question. I would encourage the audience to post more questions. So you mentioned Georgia several times, and we do have a question from Leila Melikishvili in or from Georgia, I assume. And she is saying, what do you propose we do in Georgia? What is your game plan for the countries in that bottom third? What's the way forward?
Right. Well, let me just start by answering this by pointing out that Georgia is actually a model country. Like if you read IMF or World Bank reports, you'll see that Georgia has the best business environment in the world, until, by the way, the World Bank canceled its doing business index recently because it was gamed so often by countries, including Georgia, right? But Georgia has a widespread and continues to spread its reputation of being a fantastic place to do business and one of the best economies in the world. Actually, as I'm sure you're referring to, it has one of the worst economic performances, not only in the post-communist countries, but in history of any country during this period, okay? So, and we recently did a podcast on related issue with some people in Georgia who are kind of more on the left, and we're discussing the political environment there, which is very challenging, right? Because anytime one criticizes the kind of neoliberal consensus in Georgia, one's accused of being pro-Russian, which of course is a bad thing because Russia's invaded the country and occupies parts of the country. I mean, I think the answers are, that we would put forward is, again, basically the basic answer is very simple. You need to have an economy that works for at least a majority of the people, right, in a democracy. And what are those policies? Well, everybody knows what those policies are. It's not rocket science, right? It's basically the Scandinavian countries, which have high support for democracy and government, basically have a strong welfare state. It isn't probably as obtrusive as the one that existed under communism. But, for instance, Georgia doesn't have any real health insurance, right? You don't have universal health insurance in Georgia, as far as I know. And, people feel put out by that. They feel disappointed by that. There's a lot of things which people had in the past Apparently, people used to go visit their neighbors more, because in Georgia, it's a strong norm to bring some cakes or cookies, when you go to visit somebody. And people didn't have any money to bring cakes or cookies, and they stopped visiting people, right? We talk a lot about the sociability aspect of communism and how that declined very rapidly, and that's just one instance of that. So what to do? I mean, I think universal policies have to be put in place. The kind of neoliberal model, which is basically sort of half a welfare state, where there's, as I understand, say health insurance for some conditions, for some things, but then you're on your own for everything else, is kind of this targeted or partial welfare state that tries to emphasize individual responsibility. It's not really what people want, right? And it's not, even if it works for some part of the population, it's failing other parts of the population. So you need sort of broader, kind of social policies that really pick up a broader share of the population. And by the way, that's exactly what populists are doing in Central Europe. So I would honestly look at them kind of as models. With the Family 500 Plus program in Poland isn't targeted. It's any family who has a kid gets a benefit. You have to sign up for it. So I guess you could opt out. But if you have a kid or two kids or whatever, you just sign up for, a little form at the beginning of the school year, and you get your 500 zlotys, coming in. That's a universal social program, which disproportionately helps the poor and the marginal, but it also helps middle-class families, essentially. It doesn't help the rich that much, presumably. But that's the type of thing that'll just spread prosperity to a wider section of the population. And I think that's urgently needed. And if we were to advise the World Bank, I think there is a debate in the bank about, universal benefits. It's not one, but I think that's one clear, sort of lesson.
Great, thanks. I can see that the Georgian economy is in a deep hole, but I did just Google life expectancy in Georgia, and even if this healthcare system has collapsed, it's now 74 years, which is 4 years than it was back in 1990.
Correct. Yeah, and that brings up a great point, Peter, which is that we find, and I soft pedaled that in this presentation just because of focus, but we find that there's not just one crisis. Actually, there's like at least 3 different crises that happen in post-communist countries. One of which is the economic crisis, a second of which is a sort of demographic and mortality crisis, and the third of which is an out-migration crisis. And they don't, interestingly, hit all countries in the same way, right? So some countries like Central Asia, collapsing economies, life expectancy does great. And in fact, the population of Uzbekistan has boomed. The population of Tajikistan has boomed, right? And so you don't find the same, there's only a few countries like Ukraine, which is hit by all 3 of these crises, but they're driven by very different things. So the out-migration crisis is often driven by proximity to the EU. So it often hits countries that are relatively well off, like Bulgaria. Right? It doesn't hit places that are a little further away from the EU quite as much. I believe Georgia was hit by a massive out-migration, but I'd have to check that. But you're right just to point out that even though the economy collapsed by 60% or something, the life expectancy is up pretty well. I don't know if I can fully explain it. I can say one thing is that we know it has to do with alcohol. So that probably Georgians are not drinking as much as other people. They may be more of a wine culture from what I can tell. On the other feature, I think, is closeness to the land. So for countries where going back to the village was an option, I think that sustained life much more than in places that were heavily urbanized, where people had ruptured those ties. So that's how I would personally look at Central Asia in particular. And I believe the similar thing holds true for Georgia. But, that would require a lot more digging down into the thing. The biggest digging down we did in Georgia was really on the how they managed to rise up the doing business index so rapidly while having a collapsing economy.
Yeah, I think they could probably Kyrgyzstan in the same category, because they were also a leader of reforms. Before I take the next question, I would ask Janet Johnson if you want to chip in with anything at this point.
Not really. I'm really enjoying this conversation. That last person was one of my students, so that was exciting. But just to clarify back to Peter, is that I wasn't suggesting that outmigration, I think focusing on outmigration for individuals is very different than focusing on the consequences for the country that the people came from. And I do agree with Kristen and Mitchell that the outmigration from the rural regions to the cities and from countries to other places is a tragedy for those countries. Not in a simplistic way, right? I think Russia's always thinking about like only Russians, and there's plenty of Chinese that want to move to Russia. It's more complicated, but it is a tragedy when your peoples are hollowed out. I think that is not inconsequential. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's a tragedy for the communities, but if you think of the migration from rural to urban China, it's like those individuals who are doing that are doing it because they think they'll be better off. So yeah, let's go to the next question. Mark Berenson is asking, I know this is a kind of causation question, so Mitch, feel free to decline, but Mark is asking about the trajectory of the bottom 10. And he's kind of implying that part of the problem was they were slow to embark on reforms at the beginning of the 1990s, and then they never managed to kind of dig those out.
So let me just say, Mark, we don't deal with causation issues. So this is not part of the book, but I'm working with actually a research assistant who put together all the data, Nick Emery, who's now a grad student at UCLA, on a separate paper, a spin-off paper. It is very clearly the finding, and this is another big news flash I'm going to tell you guys here that probably most people obviously haven't heard about. Economic reforms are not at all correlated with economic growth rates in the post-communist region. Let me just repeat that. There is no correlation between economic reforms, the speed of economic reforms, and economic growth rates. And that is not widely known. However, Jeffrey Sachs himself has a paper on this, which shows that if you want to explain economic growth rates, you got to look at geography, and you've got to look at oil revenues, a couple other things. There's no evidence at the moment. Now, there was evidence in the 90s, right? For a few years, there was a strong correlation between how reforming you were and what your growth rate is, but that got wiped out in the 2000s when oil prices picked back up. And a big piece of growth in this region is oil and natural resources. So basically that's a wrong finding. It's a belief that is widely held in international institutions, and it's totally incorrect. And there are dozens of papers about this. It's since the 2000s, all the papers that have been written have shown very inconclusive findings or negative findings, about this issue. And in typical Sachs fashion, he doesn't make the point in his paper that economic reforms don't matter. He just talks about other things like geography matters, right? But in fact, economic reforms don't matter. And that was verified, by the way. We presented that at our conference. Anders Asland, grudgingly, again, when we talk to some of the World Bank people, they often don't want to agree with us, but they have to say, yeah, unfortunately, that's true. And I don't think any of them are wondering much about why that is, but honestly, I think it does raise some very important questions about development economics. What were they doing? Why were they doing it? Why didn't it work? That need to be hashed out. I'm not sure they will be, but we're going to try to at least put something in that.
Great. I'd like to go back to the social trust question, because I think you linked to your vaccination resistance article, which is a terribly important issue. And the data show clearly that Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, and I think Latvia are really the bottom of the pile with 30% or less vaccinated. So this is a real puzzle, again, which we scholarly community have been slow to address 2 years into the pandemic. Only now is it really getting any airtime. But my question would be specifically about social trust in the communist period, that we can see that the social trust has eroded once we started doing the surveys in the 1990s. But I'm wondering about the character of social trust in the communist period. I know there weren't the kind of surveys done then that we can do now, but my impression as a kind of sidewalk sociologist visiting many of these countries in in the 1980s and even 1970s is that there was very, very high level of trust within the family and the network of friends, and very low levels of trust with anything else, right? Any public agency. So again, I don't want to beat the horse again that the communism is to blame, but it does seem to me that this pattern of now pathologically dangerous low levels of social trust, the fear and mistrust of the government in Russia and Ukraine, which is, I think, killing hundreds of thousands of people, you know, that's a problem that evolved over generations. That's what I would posit.
Yeah, so I really like to speak directly to that because I've just been in Bulgaria as well, where now Bulgaria has the highest death rate. I mean, and their vaccination rate is 22%. It's the lowest in the EU. And I had many conversations in Bulgaria with friends and family and colleagues and students. And the one thing I can tell you is your sort of sidewalk sociologist view is not incorrect in the sense that, yes, people had low trust in institutions during communism. Not everybody, but quite a lot of people. But they had very high levels of trust to their neighbors and their families and their friends and their colleagues and their social networks. And I think that the reason, like, look, people in the United States have very, very low levels of trust in the government as well, but they report pretty high levels of trust in their communities, in their church congregations, in their, you know, the fellow sports fans, and their, you know, even though we have the whole bowling alone phenomenon, there's still enough of a level of social trust between and amongst people that if your neighbor says that they're getting the vaccine or your colleague says that they're getting the vaccine, then you might think, okay, some, you know, people I know are getting the vaccine, it's probably safe, it's not a big conspiracy. I think the problem in Bulgaria, and I faced this myself, is that, you know, I said, like, I got the vaccine. I don't think there are any nanobots in my body. It's not rewriting my DNA. I'm the same person I was before I got the vaccine. But people think I'm on the payroll of the pharmaceutical companies, which is, you know, I mean, it's preposterous. These are people I've known for 20 years. But the level of interpersonal trust has been so profoundly eroded in places like Ukraine, in places like Bulgaria. I mean, this conversation that Mitchell and I had about, you know, people can't go to each other's houses for tea to hang out because they don't have enough money to buy cookies or cakes. I mean, this is just a problem that is writ large throughout the region. And you can actually have a fair amount of social solidarity against the state, which is precisely, I think, what happened. The ethnographic data shows this very clearly across the former Eastern Bloc countries, that people had social solidarity with each other against the institutions, against the state. And what's happened since 1989 or 91, depending on where you are, is that the lateral sociability, the connections and networks that people had that sort of helped them survive, were completely destroyed. I mean, Olga Shevchenko's book about crisis in everyday life in Moscow so beautifully describes this process of the destruction of the social safety net, of the destruction of people's networks and social solidarities. So I think that's a lot of what's going on with vaccine hesitancy or skepticism or just outright kind of conspiratorial thinking, is that it's gotten so extreme that people think that even their neighbors, even their family members, are not telling them the truth. And that is a very profoundly unwell society, not only because of the pandemic.
Great, that's a very powerful statement, and maybe it can serve as a closing statement from you, Kristen. And I would invite Mitchell and Janet if you also want to make some kind of concluding remarks, and then we can kind of wrap things up.
Janet, do you want to go ahead?
I don't have much to sort of close up. I guess I was just really thinking about what it means, what COVID will mean for us, you know, both kind of globally and individually. You know, of course, this vaccine hesitancy is common across various communities in the United States and other places, right? And populism has been popular in various places as well. And, you know, this is the question, right, that all of us who were steeped in this period, right, we all come of age in a certain period of the changes that were happening in Central Eastern Europe is, how long is this going to matter? And I just wonder, I was just reflecting upon how much COVID, I mean, I guess you can't really think about it while you're in the middle of it, right? Like how much this is going to shift our thinking about all these issues. But I would just say, y'all, this is an amazing book. And now that I understand sort of the audience a little bit better, I can see, that the reasoning around it. And I really, as a person who's lived in the world with friends and communities in these places, I really hope that people think more deeply about the real, I think, Peter, to your point, right, there's a way of seeing crisis. I think about Nancy Reese's book about like Russian talk. They're going to complain. There's a way that framing that what people say doesn't necessarily reflect reality, but I'm persuaded that this was a gigantic depression and that we should take it seriously and understand the long-term consequences of that. So I really appreciate the book.
Yeah, I guess that's a great place to close. And let me just say that, one of the debates that we're engaged in is the transition over, right? We heard this many times from our World Bank colleagues, and he was like, what are you talking about 30 years ago? You guys are crazy. We need to talk about what policies need to be enacted in the next 10 years. And we also hear it from academic colleagues from time to time who say, well, why are you still talking about transition, right? I think that our perspective on transition is this. Transition was one of the huge events of 20th, 21st century Europe, okay? It is on a par with the First World War. It's on a par with the Russian Revolution. It's on a par with the Second World War, okay? It had obviously many fewer deaths than a typical war, but it had a bigger economic effect. A bigger disaster happened at the same time as really remarkable growth and opportunity for millions of people. Okay, so it's a collective shared experience that will never be done with. Okay, it's, the United States, our bankruptcy laws are based on the experience that we had in the Great Depression. Transition is going to have an impact on this region for 100 years, most likely, in our opinion. Okay. So transition studies, if you've devoted a lot of your life to it, as Kristen and I have, don't worry about it. It's a good investment because people are going to talk about transition forever. When COVID comes up and you see that there are deep legacies of distrust that were created, maybe I don't dismiss Peter's view that in part related to the communist history, but they're created largely also in the post-communist period of this huge disappointment with the results of transition in many countries and a lack of trust that actually spans both the successful and unsuccessful countries. Because even in the successful countries of Central and Eastern Europe, people still think that the capitalism is unfair and the privatization was unfair and that they have a corrupt bureaucracy and that politicians are all corrupt and that the whole system's corrupt, okay? And those things really came out of the experience of transition. So we felt by the end of this really secure in our jobs, honestly. And, and anytime an issue comes up about COVID or something else, we can see in the data in very empirical ways, these legacies that are going to be with us for a very, very long period of time. So I think that's also an interesting debate, that we hope to get into at some point. With people who think that the transition is over. And like the Great Depression, it's never really over. It's a collective experience that was different than many, because in many wartime experiences, everybody's suffering. In a depression, everybody's suffering. In this instance, a lot of people suffered and a lot of people did fantastically well. We don't need to be reminded of that because most of our colleagues in the region are people like that. Most of the people we interact with who have highly educated were like that. So, so I think it's a confusing legacy for a lot of people. People don't fully understand how to encompass this, but it's a legacy that's going to be with us for a long time.
In conclusion, I would point out again, playing the nationalism card, that one dimension of the transition was, of course, the collapse of the multinational empires.
Absolutely.
In Yugoslavia, and that's why in your examples, when you're talking about trauma narratives, Belgrade, that's part of the regret, right? That they've lost being the center of that larger political project. And talking of vaccines, the next panel on the virtual ASN will in fact be about vaccine nationalism and maybe vaccine hesitancy as well. And that'll be chaired by Florian Bieber, and that will be on December the 9th, next month. So thanks to our patient audience, and thanks to our panelists for a lively and I think fruitful and consensus building discussion. So we will look forward to hearing more from you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.